There's a mountain settlement in eastern Kentucky where something is wrong with the names on the gravestones. Not just similar, not just coincidence. The same surname appears 73 times in a cemetery built for a town of less than 200 souls. And it's not a common name. It's not Smith or Johnson. It's Tolliver, over and over. Tolliver, carved into limestone markers that date back to 1862. Some of the graves are for children. Some are unmarked entirely, but the name keeps repeating like an echo that never fades, like something trying to tell you a truth you don't want to hear. The town is called Pinehallow. You won't find it on most maps anymore. It sits in a valley so narrow that sunlight only reaches the valley floor for 4 hours a day in winter. The roads leading in are unpaved and treacherous. The few residents who remain don't talk much to outsiders. And when you ask them about the Tollivers, they look at you like you've just opened a door that should have stayed locked. Then they walk away, because in Pinehallow, silence isn't just golden, it's survival. This isn't a story about folklore. It's not about legends passed down around campfires. This is about what happens when a family closes in on itself for generations, when isolation becomes identity, when bloodlines tangle so tightly that the family tree stops branching and starts circling back on itself like a serpent eating its own tail. The Tollivers didn't just live in Pinehallow, they became Pinehallow. And what emerged from that fusion of place and blood is something the rest of America chose to forget. Because this isn't just about one family in one forgotten valley. It's about what we allow to happen when we look away. About the cost of silence, about the children born into circumstances they didn't choose, carrying genetic burdens they couldn't understand, living lives that were over before they began. The Tollivers are a case study in what happens when geography becomes prison, when family becomes fate, and when no one from the outside world bothers to ask why so many graves carry the same name. This is their story. And if you're still watching, you need to understand something. You won't be able to forget what you're about to learn. The Tolliver family arrived in what would become Pinehallow in 1858. 3 brothers, Samuel, Josiah, and Ephraim. They came from Virginia, fleeing something the records don't specify. Land disputes, some say. Others whisper about a killing. What matters is that they brought their wives, their children, and a determination to disappear into the mountains where no law could follow them. They found a valley that seemed designed for exactly that purpose. Steep ridges on all sides, one way in, one way out, a creek that ran cold and clear, timber everywhere. It must have felt like freedom. It must have felt like safety. It was neither. By 1860, the 3 families had built cabins, cleared land, and established themselves as the only permanent residents of the valley. They named it Pinehallow, though no one remembers why. The Civil War came and went. The Tollivers stayed neutral, hidden, untouched by the conflict that tore the nation apart. They were already building their own world, separate from everything outside. A world with its own rules, its own logic, its own terrible momentum. Here's where the pattern starts. Samuel's oldest son, Nathan, married Josiah's daughter, Rebecca, in 1864. They were first cousins. In that era, in isolated communities, this wasn't unusual. But it was the beginning, because when Nathan and Rebecca had children, those children grew up knowing only other Tollivers. And when those children came of age, they married other Tollivers. Cousins married cousins. Second cousins married second cousins. By the time the 1880s arrived, nearly every marriage in Pinehallow was between people who shared not just a surname, but grandparents, sometimes parents. The genetic consequences didn't take long to appear. Birth defects, stillbirths, children who didn't live past infancy, the cemetery filled with small graves. But here's what makes this story different from other tales of isolated communities. The Tollivers didn't stop. They didn't seek outside help. They didn't bring in new families. They closed ranks tighter, because by then, Pinehallow wasn't just where they lived, it was who they were. The outside world was foreign, dangerous, corrupted. The valley was pure. The family was sacred. And if children were born sick, if babies died, if the bloodline was weakening, that was God's will. That was the price of purity. That was the cost of staying together, staying separate, staying Tolliver, and they paid it over and over, generation after generation. They paid it with the bodies of their children. By 1900, Pinehallow had become something that shouldn't exist in modern America. A genetic island, a closed loop of DNA folding in on itself with mathematical precision. There were 47 people living in the valley. 43 of them were named Tolliver. The other 4 were Tolliver wives who'd been born with different surnames in neighboring counties, brought in briefly, absorbed into the family structure, and never seen outside the valley again. Their children were Tollivers. Their grandchildren were Tollivers, and those grandchildren married each other. The signs were everywhere by then. Medical records from a traveling doctor who passed through in 1903 describe conditions he'd never seen before. Children with skeletal deformities, profound developmental delays, seizure disorders that ran through family lines like water finding cracks in stone. One entry describes a girl of 14 with the cognitive function of a 4-year-old, caring for her 3 younger siblings, all of whom showed similar impairments. The doctor recommended immediate intervention. He suggested the family allow some children to be placed in state care where they could receive treatment. The Tollivers ran him out of the valley at gunpoint. He never came back. No doctor did for another 30 years. Because here's what you have to understand about Pinehallow. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't simple mountain folk not knowing any better. The Tollivers knew their children were suffering. They knew the marriages between close relatives were causing harm. They'd buried enough babies to understand cause and effect, but they'd built their entire identity around separation from the outside world, around family loyalty that transcended everything else, around the idea that Tollivers took care of Tollivers and no one else could be trusted. To admit they needed help would have meant admitting their entire way of life was wrong. It would have meant opening the valley to outsiders. It would have meant the end of Pinehallow as they knew it. So they chose the children's suffering over their own dissolution. They chose bloodline over health. They chose to keep the family together, even as the family destroyed itself from within. And the state of Kentucky let them. Because Pinehallow was remote, because the Tollivers caused no trouble beyond their borders, because in early 20th century America, what happened in isolated mountain communities stayed in isolated mountain communities. No one wanted to deal with the complexity, the cost, the moral weight of intervention, so they didn't. They let it continue year after year, decade after decade. The graves multiplied, the genetic damage compounded, and the Tollivers kept marrying each other, kept having children, kept pretending that everything was as God intended it to be. 1937, a social worker named Margaret Hendricks became the first outsider in decades to spend significant time in Pinehallow. She'd been sent by the state to conduct a rural health survey, part of a New Deal program assessing conditions in Appalachian communities. What she found in that valley changed her. Her reports, archived now in the Kentucky State Library, read like dispatches from another world. A world where time had stopped and biology had turned against itself. She documented 23 children under the age of 15. Not one of them attended school. Literacy was nearly non-existent among anyone born after 1900. She found multiple cases of what we now know as recessive genetic disorders, conditions that only manifest when both parents carry the same damaged gene, conditions that become inevitable when the gene pool shrinks to the size of a single extended family. She described a boy of 12 who couldn't speak, couldn't walk, spent his days tied to a chair on a cabin porch because there was no other way to keep him safe. She described twin girls, 8 years old, both blind from birth, both with severe intellectual disabilities. She described families where every child showed signs of inbreeding depression, smaller stature, increased susceptibility to disease, shortened lifespans, features that had become so common in Pinehallow that the Tollivers no longer saw them as abnormal. Hendricks tried to help, she really did. She arranged for a medical team to visit. She worked to establish a small schoolhouse. She even found families in Lexington willing to take in some of the children, to give them a chance at education and medical care. The Tollivers refused everything. They saw her not as help, but as invasion, as threat, as the thin edge of a wedge that would split their family apart and destroy everything they'd built. And in a way, they were right. Because what Hendricks represented was the end of their isolation, the end of their autonomy, the end of their ability to live by their own rules, no matter how destructive those rules had become. She left Pinehallow after 6 weeks. Her final report recommended immediate state intervention, mandatory education, medical oversight, genetic counseling, though that term barely existed in 1937. She wrote that without intervention, the Tolliver family would continue its genetic decline until it could no longer sustain itself. She predicted that within 3 generations, the bloodline would collapse entirely. The state reviewed her report. They filed it. They did nothing, because it was the Depression, because there were bigger problems, because intervening in Pinehallow would have required resources, legal battles, and a level of sustained commitment no one was willing to provide. So Margaret Hendricks went on to her next assignment, and the Tollivers went on dying slowly in their valley, one damaged child at a time. The pattern continued for another 30 years. The bloodline tightened. The genetic damage deepened. By the 1960s, Pinehallow had 21 residents. 18 were Tollivers by birth. 3 were women who'd married in, though even they came from families with distant Tolliver connections. The family tree had become a knot. Uncles were also cousins. Aunts were also nieces. The relationships had grown so tangled that untangling them would require a geneticist and a week of work. The Tollivers themselves had stopped trying to explain how they were related. They were just family, that's all that mattered. They were all family. The children born in this era faced odds that shouldn't exist in any human population. Infant mortality in Pinehallow approached 40%. 4 out of every 10 babies born did not survive their first year. Those who did survive often carried disabilities so severe that their lives became exercises in suffering. There are medical records now from the few times authorities were called in for emergencies. A boy born in 1960, with his heart on the wrong side of his chest. A girl in 1960, 7 with bones so brittle she broke her femur learning to walk. A set of twins in 1970 who shared more than just a womb. They shared organs. They lived for 6 hours after birth. The family buried them in a single small coffin, unmarked like so many others, and still the marriages continued, because by then stopping would have meant admitting that everything that had come before was wrong. It would have meant acknowledging that the children who'd suffered, the babies who'd died, the graves that filled the hillside, all of it had been preventable. All of it had been the result of choices the family made. That weight was too heavy to carry, so they didn't carry it. They convinced themselves it was God's plan. They told themselves they were being tested. They believed that their suffering meant something, that their loyalty to each other mattered more than the physical cost, that keeping the family pure was worth any price, even the price of their children's lives. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have been the one to break the pattern? Would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed, convinced that family loyalty was sacred, that the outside world couldn't understand, that suffering together was better than surviving apart? Because that's the real horror of Pinehallow. Not that it happened, but that it kept happening, generation after generation, with every opportunity to stop, with every warning sign, with every small grave. They chose this. Over and over, they chose this. In 1979, a fire in Pinehallow destroyed 2 cabins and killed 4 people, 3 adults and 1 child. The state fire marshal's investigation brought in outside authorities for the first time in decades. What they found went far beyond the fire. They found a community on the edge of genetic collapse. They found children living in conditions that violated every health and safety standard on the books. They found evidence of developmental disabilities so severe that survival into adulthood seemed almost miraculous. And they found a family that still refused help, that still insisted outsiders had no right to interfere, that still believed their way of life was worth protecting, no matter the cost. This time, the state didn't look away. Social workers removed 6 children from Pinehallow between 1979 and 1981. Court orders, foster care. The children were placed with families outside the valley, given medical treatment, enrolled in special education programs. The Tollivers fought it every step of the way. They hired lawyers. They filed appeals. They claimed religious persecution, cultural discrimination, government overreach. They argued that their children were fine, that outsiders were exaggerating the problems, that the family had survived for over a century without interference and didn't need it now. The courts disagreed, the removals stood, and Pinehallow never recovered, because here's what happened when you finally broke the pattern. The family didn't adapt, it fractured. Some Tollivers left the valley entirely, scattering to towns across Kentucky, cutting ties with Pinehallow and everyone in it. Others stayed but stopped having children, the bloodline ending with them by choice or by biology too damaged to continue. A few tried to rebuild, marrying people from outside the valley, bringing in new genetic material for the first time in generations, but the damage was done. The community that had defined itself by isolation couldn't survive integration. The identity that had been built on bloodline purity couldn't adapt to dilution. Pinehallow, as it had existed for over 100 years, died not with violence, but with dispersal, with the slow recognition that what they'd built couldn't be sustained, that it should never have been sustained in the first place. By 1990, fewer than 10 people lived in Pinehallow full-time. The cabins fell into disrepair. The cemetery, with its 73 Tolliver graves, became overgrown. The valley that had once felt like sanctuary became a graveyard, not just for the bodies buried there, but for an entire way of life. A way of life built on a foundation of genetic ruin and justified by a belief in family loyalty so absolute it consumed the family from within. The Tollivers had tried to create something pure, something separate, something that would last forever. Instead, they created a cautionary tale about what happens when ideology trumps biology, when belief becomes more important than the lives of children, when silence and isolation are mistaken for strength. Today, Pinehallow is almost empty. 3 residents remain, all elderly, all Tollivers by birth. They don't give interviews. They don't welcome visitors. The road into the valley is barely passable. The cabins are collapsing into themselves, reclaimed by the forest that surrounds them. The cemetery is still there, though the stones are weathered now, some illegible, the names fading like the family itself. 73 graves with the surname Tolliver. 73 3 markers for a genetic experiment that should never have been allowed to continue as long as it did. Geneticists who have studied the Tolliver family describe it as one of the most extreme cases of sustained inbreeding in documented American history. The coefficient of inbreeding, the mathematical measure of genetic similarity between parents, reached levels typically only seen in laboratory experiments, levels that guarantee the expression of recessive disorders. Levels that make survival itself a form of biological defiance. The children who were removed from Pinehallow in the 80s are adults now. Some have families of their own. Some struggle with health issues that will follow them for life, the genetic legacy of generations of closed breeding. None of them speak publicly about their childhood in the valley. The trauma is too deep, the shame too heavy. They carry the weight of decisions made a century before they were born. And here's the question that haunts this story. The question that should haunt anyone who learns about Pinehallow. How did this happen in America? How did a family destroy itself genetically over the course of 120 years, while the rest of the country looked away? The answer is uncomfortable. It happened because isolation is easy to ignore, because problems in remote places don't demand attention the way problems in cities do, because intervening in family structures, even destructive ones, requires a level of commitment and resources that governments rarely provide until crisis becomes catastrophe. And by the time crisis becomes catastrophe, generations have already paid the price. The Tollivers believed they were protecting something sacred: family, heritage, independence, the right to live by their own rules in their own place without interference from a world they didn't trust. And in service of that belief, they sacrificed their children, not with intention, not with malice, but with a kind of willful blindness that might be worse, because they knew, on some level, they always knew. They saw the babies die, they buried the children, they watched the disabilities compound, and they kept choosing isolation over intervention. They kept choosing belief over biology. They kept choosing the family as it was over the family as it could have been. Pinehallow is a ghost town now, but the ghosts aren't the ones in the cemetery. The ghosts are the children who were never born healthy, the lives that were cut short or lived in suffering because genetics became ideology and family became prison. The Tollivers are almost gone now. The surname that once dominated a valley will soon exist only in records and memories and DNA databases that tell a story of genetic collapse. And maybe that's as it should be. Maybe some family trees aren't meant to continue. Maybe some bloodlines carry too much damage to survive. Maybe the valley will finally rest when the last Tolliver is buried in that hillside cemetery, when the pattern that began in 1858 finally, mercifully ends. The mountain will remain, the graves will remain, and the name Tolliver, repeated 73 times in stone, will stand as a reminder of what happens when we love something so much we destroy it, when we hold on so tightly we crush what we're trying to protect, when we choose blood over everything else, even the lives of those whose blood we claim to cherish.